Hi, wonderful freshmen. Now, we basically are done with, as I called the meat and potatoes of the unit when it comes to the Industrial Revolution and imperialism. So I'll find this time useful to provide us with some case studies, if you will, some examples of big events that were significant to um, these eras. So today we're going to look a little bit at the Berlin Conference. It was from 1884 to 1885, and it was a meeting at which the major European powers negotiated and formalized claims to territory in Africa. It's sometimes also called the Berlin West Africa Conference. But it marks the climax of European competition for territory in Africa. So we're going to look at that, and we're also going to look at a little bit about the U.S. involvement in the Berlin Conference, even though this is a world history course, of course. So this is also known as the Scramble for Africa. And during the 1870s and the early 1880s, European nations like Great Britain, France, and Germany began to look for Africa for natural resources for the their commerce, right? Because we already learned about this. So the Industrial Revolution fueled the needs for raw materials and also for potential markets. So as a result, these countries wanted to safeguard their commercial interests in Africa from other countries that were competing in Africa. And they began to send scouts to the continent to secure treaties from the indigenous people there or representatives of theirs. And we also learned a bit about Belgium's King Leopold II, who wanted to increase his personal wealth by acquiring African territory. So he hired agents to lay claim to the vast tracts of land. Oh, it's 9 o'clock in Africa. To protect Germany's commercial interests, German Chancellor Otto von Bismarck, who otherwise was really uninterested in Africa, felt compelled to stake claims to African land. So, what was going on in Africa at the time? 80% was still under traditional control, not, controlled by Europeans or other powers. But as we'll see, this conference divided it into about 50 irregular countries that paid no respect to the local culture there. This map was supposed to show indigenous languages of Africa, but I realize it shows more modern language families in Africa. But just get the idea that there were many different cultures, and it didn't really respect that as it divided up the lines. Okay, so right now the idea was, do European countries want to go to war over this, or do they want to try to work this out? And you may see how this cartoon sort of think of our quote about the magnificent cake, so to speak. So at this time, you had West Africa, both was interested by Britain and France. Egypt was interested by the Portuguese. Britain also was looking into East Africa, Central Africa by King Leopold of Belgium. So in 1884, the meeting is called. And there were 14 countries that attended when it opened on November 15th of 1884. So you can see all of the countries listed here. Keep in mind, I know you see Sweden-Norway. It was a unified country between 1814 and 1905, in case you didn't know that. Okay. So what were some of the decisions they made? Well, the initial task was to agree that the Congo River and the Niger River mouths and basins would be considered neutral and open to trade. So it did that. It established free trade among colonies and also a framework for future claims. It provided no say to the people of Africa. They were not involved with any of these decisions. And legitimized and formalized the colonization process, and it sparked new interest in Africa. By 1900, the European states claimed about 90% of Africa. So remember how different that was from the figure I gave you from the beginning. Following the conference, the give and take continued. By 1914, the conference participants fully divided Africa among themselves into 15 countries. So, like Great Britain wanted a Cape to Cairo collection of colonies and almost succeeded, as they controlled Egypt, the Sudan, Uganda, Kenya, South Africa, Zambia, Zimbabwe, and Botswana, which is now Rhodesia. The British also controlled Nigeria and Ghana and the Gold Coast. France took much of Western Africa from Mauritania to Chad and Gabon in the Republic of Congo. Belgium and King Leopold II controlled the Congo area, and so on and so forth. So when you understand the effects and you see some of the issues facing Africa today, you see a lot of it is from this. So this book, Geography, Realms, Regions, and Concepts, which was published in 1997, written by H.D. DeBlige and Peter O'Muller, this quote really sort of reflects that. They write, "The Berlin Conference was Africa's undoing in more ways than one. The colonial powers superimposed their domains on the African continent. By the time independence returned to Africa in 1950, the realm had acquired a legacy of political fragmentation that could neither be eliminated nor made to operate satisfactorily." And I know we're a world history course, and you're supposed to sort of cover the U.S. perspective next year, but honestly, U.S. history doesn't really cover the Berlin Conference. That is significant in itself, and I won't get to that now, but we can talk about it in class. But why was the U.S. there? And when I wrote those 14 countries, I was like, whoa, the U.S. didn't take any colonies there, so why was the U.S. there? Well, remember, this is the post-Civil War era. Think of what's going on in our country at the time. It's continuing to industrialize, but it continues to face the problems of Reconstruction. And you also have racial issues in our country. Now that says Minister Jo Vienna, but the minister to Vienna and Berlin, which should also be capitalized, was John A. Casson, who was an Iowa, a politician from Iowa, under the administrations of Hayes and Chester Arthur. Now, let's look at his perspective socially. He claimed that blacks as a whole were unfit to vote, and in fact, he encouraged people to do as you please about the right of suffrage in your state. His desires can be reflected as he wanted to maintain white harmony and to promote African commerce, whether it be in the U.S. Or in Africa. In other words, he didn't want to see white people fighting over black people, is the harsh way to put it. So in his attempts to promote and protect commerce, he became involved in African affairs and became influential in the developments. He observed European interest in Central Africa, and he became instrumental in persuading our Secretary of State, Frelinghuysen, right, there's a connection to New Jersey there, to support American involvement in Africa. Once again, not willing to see white men fight over privileges in Africa, he welcomed Chancellor Bismarck's call for a conference in Africa in Berlin. Casson believed that this initiative would avert further strife and even warlike collisions in the remarkable struggle now going on between the commercial rival powers for advantages in the African trade. So protection of commerce, this was a major concern for the U.S., and that's why they were at the Berlin Conference. America also had a close relationship between Belgium's King Leopold and Henry Sanford, who was the American minister to Brussels in earlier presidencies like of Lincoln and Johnson. And Sanford became close to Leopold's growing interest in Central Africa. So there was more of a connection there than we really probably want to admit. Okay, and you can go on and on about the relationship there. If you want to talk about it, I'll discuss it in class. I just recently read a paper about it when I was curious about all of this. We also have another name you might recognize, Alabama Senator John Morgan, who was an influential member of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, wanted to annex Cuba and the Philippines, right? So we weren't really imperializing Africa, but we had our own sort of smaller interests in imperialism throughout the world. But they wanted to see the Congo as possibly a place not just for trade, but where former slaves could go. Maybe we don't want them in the U.S., but they can go there. We'll talk about that in Liberia at some other point. So really a sort of ugly sort of thing to think about. I will note that the U.S. did not sign the treaty that was ratified because eventually an anti-imperialist, Grover Cleveland, became the presidency. That's not to say we didn't still have involvements with trade, but not as official as maybe people like Casson would want it. Okay, we can definitely talk about this more in class, and ask me if you have any questions. And I hope you're all surviving this snow.